We'd like to welcome you all to our Yom Hashoah program this year. We were thinking, myself and Jessica and the rabbi, we were trying to come up with an idea, something that would be new and fresh and people had not yet seen. I was talking with a dear friend of mine a little while ago, Nathan Lowe, and Nathan said, I have a dear friend that you have to meet. He's a very special person. And I think at the time you sent me over his bio. And what's so interesting to me is that normally when people recite a bio, when they introduce somebody, they're reciting, so to speak, a little bit of a biography. Something, a little bit of, what describes the life of a wonderful man. But after meeting Ted yesterday on the phone for quite some time, and after seeing and sitting with him today, what interests me more about his bio is not his biography, but his biology. They just don't make them like they used to. Theodore Comet is not only a shooting star. He is again, it's hard to find these words. They don't necessarily translate across all languages. He is what we would call a varmeyid, a warm Jew. A Jew that oozes with care and authenticity and a genuine nature and a desire to help. And how many times have we heard the famous slogan, never forget. And we titled this evening, We Will Never Forget. Not as a statement perhaps that goes backwards in its promise, but perhaps looks in a different way, looks forwards. And there's something special when you meet a special Jew who's been working for Am Yisrael for so long, for such a huge part of his life, and who even now, who he is happily going to be 99 in about a month's time. Kenai Nahora, Yiddish boychik, mit Hashem Punim. And he has spent so many of those years, the lion's share of those years have been in service of the Jewish people. What an unbelievable, what a remarkable thing to be able to see and to be able to witness. And I'm sure many of you have been to Yom Hashoah events that focus around bringing a Holocaust survivor to tell a story that is remarkably similar to so many of the other stories that you have heard. Theodore is not a Holocaust survivor, but Theodore is a person who has lived with the Holocaust for more than 70 years. And he is someone that has had his life be shaped by it. Every tza'ad vasha'al, every step, every moment of his life has been shaped by it. He was married to it. He was inspired by it. And it is a tremendous privilege and an honor to be able to hear from him tonight. We are trying to capture every word that he's going to say, so it's going out here to us live. It is being broadcast live on Instagram. It is being recorded, hopefully with better sound and quality. We're going to hear from him. We're Be'ezrat Hashem also going to hear from his dear wife, Aleha Shalom from Shoshana. We are in for a treat. Rabotai, settle in, buckle up. I present to you a person whose biography is only outshone by his biology. My friends, someone who was worked for the JDC, who was a part of saving Am Yisrael, a person who bleeds for the Jewish people. Please, can I have your applause for Theodore Ted Comet.
All I can say is I wish my mother was alive to hear this about her son. But I'll tell you, my favorite introductory story was, I was a member of a class of one of the outstanding Talmudic scholars, and such mundane matters as taking attendance wasn't up his alley interest. So he used to assign that to various students in the class, and the result was that you couldn't hear me. And the result was he didn't know the names of the students. So one day he took out his large board, takes out his roll book, and he says, Slakowski, recite the lesson. And Sokolsky was a good student, but that day he was unprepared, knowing the rabbi's exacting standards. He was afraid to try to bluff it through. So he sat there silent. The rabbi repeated, recite the lesson. And suddenly, out of knowing the rabbi didn't know who he was, he bursts out, Rabbi Slakowski is not here today. So the rabbi says, well, in that case, then you recite the lesson. So I'm here to recite the lesson. What's the lesson we're really talking about? Before coming here, I really decided to change some of the focus of my comments to you. My introduction to all of this became when I was 21 years old. And what happened was France, for the first and only time, brought in a group of children survivors from Auschwitz. And what happened was there was an organization called OSE, stands for Œuvre de Secours des Enfants, the Children's Aid Society, and they put these orphans in these homes. And then the head of OSE came to America, and he said, we need Madrichim to live with them, to be their big brothers and sisters, to try to fill some of the gap from their lost families. So I went there as a volunteer.
So sorry. They still can't hear so well.
Oh.
It might actually be better without the microphone. You want to give it
Can you tell me whether you can hear me adequately?
Not in the back?
No.
Not in the
Sorry.
back. Let's try this.
I was wondering why wasn't a better response to my opening joke, but okay.
Tested it again?
Does it work now? Can you hear? So now I have to say something that's worth hearing, right? No. So before I left, a friend of mine said, I have a cousin living in Versailles. Would you look him up? Because of the war, they didn't connect. I said, I have no idea where I'm going to be assigned. I put the name and address, put it in my wall, and forgot about it. And when I came to France, where do you think they sent me? To the children's home in Versailles. So I was brought there late at night. I just met the director. In the morning, we had breakfast. These are older teenagers. And across from me was this teenager, and between my broken French, Hebrew, Yiddish, we got a conversation going. I was very impressed with the teenager. And I went out for a walk, and after a few blocks, I remembered the cousin. And I take out the piece of paper, and the address said 60 Avenue de Paris. I look up, the street I'm walking on is, everybody, Avenue de Paris. I said, I can't believe I'm walking on the street. And I said 60. And I go to 60, and where does 60 is the address of the children's home. I said, I can't believe this. So when I walked in there, I went up to the only person I knew besides the director was the teenager I had breakfast with. I said, tell me, is there anybody here by the name of Elie Weisel? And he looks up at me and he said, c'est moi. That's me. And that's how we first met and began our 70-year association. It was that experience in France that completely altered my life. I went there for 1 year and stayed for 2. The thing, I didn't know much about the Holocaust. I mean, nobody really, at that time, coming from here, was really informed. And what I saw was the people who came back and struggled, those who came to France and to other places, where to go, how to go, where was family. The first thing they wanted to know were other families still alive. And so the search, and then I saw what the Joint Distribution Committee was doing in helping these people find new lives for themselves. And so what struck me was about 1990, with the Joint Distribution Committee, I set up a seminar co-sponsored by the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And I want to tell you, I was shocked when I found out that in their policy, the Holocaust ended when the war ended. And I said to them, what about the survivors and the whole life in the world afterwards? And that was the first time that they opened up and extended that grave. And this is what I call this, it's called Life Reborn. an untold story of courage. And so I wanted to share some of that because when we talk about remembrance, what does Zachor mean? It's interesting. The Jewish concept of Zachor is very different from the non-Jewish. The Jewish concept, the general concept of memory is recalling. The Jewish concept of Zachor is reliving. And we just saw the example of that in the Pesach Seder. We're all commanded to try to feel as if we personally came out. It's the idea of reliving the past that makes the past not dead, but still alive. And that to me is part of the miracle of the Jewish people. How did we manage 2,000 years to survive in a galut that was often so unsympathetic to us? And in the camps itself, what was amazing to me, well, first of all, the idea when people think about survivors, well, camp was over and their tsaros was over. It just wasn't so. The Jews, where did they go? How did they go? Usually they went back to where they came from, hoping to see family, and yet there was no family alive. And then, as you know, in Kilcha there was a pogrom, and then the Jews saw that they couldn't go back to Poland. What happened, by the way, was the Jews who were in Poland were all slaughtered before the concentration camps. So who survived from Poland? Those who managed to flee into the Soviet Union. And what happened after the war, Stalin wanted to take over Poland, so he allowed the repatriation of Polish citizens back to Poland. And that's how the Jews who survived came back. And there was about, how many Jews were they were talking about? And the Jews were caught up in some larger phenomena, which was the largest replacement of refugees in the world. Because what happened was, because the Germans, their youth was all in the army. Who was going to man their factories? And so they had this enforced labor, I'm talking about from non-Jews. So when the war was over, they had 6 million of these people, what to do with them? So the solution was repatriation, send them back to their countries. And well, where were the Jews going to go? And meanwhile, in the process, they set up these displaced persons camps. And when the first set up, the Jews lived with the non-Jews. And a lot of the non-Jews were anti-Semites. And so the Jews were suffering again, having been freed on the one hand, and on the other hand, they're there. And what happened was they wouldn't allow the Joint Distribution Committee to come in because an army wants to have control. And once you have civilians, they're no longer under your control. So the real entry were the Jewish chaplains. They were there. And then for the first time, they brought some Jewish power into play. The chaplains complained to the American Jewish community. The Jewish community brought this issue up to the president, and then they said that the Jews are suffering in these camps. And so he sent the head of the law school of Virginia to look at it. And he sent a report that said, except that don't kill them, the Jews are not treated any better than they were under the Germans. And this is when he sent an edict, and that's when they were separated out, and we had now the Jews in the DP camps. And what happened when the Jews came to these camps? What was so amazing is how they rebuilt their lives. There were schools that set up, courses were set up, services were set up. And you wonder, where did they get that energy from? This whole quest to choose life over this experience of death. It's hard to believe that the largest birth rate in the world at that time was in the DP camps. And so this Jewish approach, how do you confront death? By the creation of life. And so you had, in a sense, a whole reunification about it. A lot of people feel that this building of the State of Israel was the Jewish response to the Holocaust. And I want to say I have a slightly different amendment. I think the Jewish response was reflected in these deep hands. The fact that they're not going to take death as an ender and a solution, they're going to create new lives for themselves. So this was a story. So let me just share a couple of stories that we experienced there. And by the way, the title of Elie Weisel's memoir was "And the Sea is Never Full," which means no matter how many stories we hear, the sea will never really cover them off. And so in one place, we had a chazan called Gutfried. Afterwards, he's no longer alive, in Atlanta. And he talked about, and he lost his whole family. And the turning point for him was when he was asked to conduct the Yom Kippur tefillot, because he had been a chazan, and he turned it down on the grounds that he was too flawed in deed and in faith to do it. And the response from the camp leadership was, "You don't understand. We're not a minion of the living, but a minion of the dead, and a minion of the dead has the power to exonerate. Now go and daven." And he said that was the turning point in his life. And so we had Jewish survivors themselves uprooted, and the exact figure is really hard to come by. Yehuda Bauer was one of the big experts, estimates that 500,000 Jews were alive at the end of the war. And what happened was the death marches, as the Russians and the Allies came close to the camps, they didn't just leave the Jews there, they had them march. And they lost about 200, half of those Jews died in those marches. And then the thousands who returned to Poland, Hungary, Romania, searching for relatives again. You had the pogrom in Poland, and the total number of Jewish DPs was 300,000. And then this was the DP camp experience. And there was a request then to Britain from Truman to let 300,000 Jews come into Palestine. And they refused it. And those 300,000 became the driving point that in the end led to the establishment of this state of Israel. Because the theme of Israel was so strong in our camps. Let me just tell you one small personal example. In my home, we had a group of older boys, and they got caught up in the movement called the Bricha. And the Bricha is not well enough known, because the issue is if you had hundreds of thousands of Jews floating around, who guides them? And where do you take them? And there was this organization called the Bricha that was set up by the Jewish Agency, which was the pre-state organization in Palestine. And they brought all these Jews there. And they set up ports of embarkation for boats to try to block the British blockade. Of course, the British had nothing better to do with their armed forces after the war than to prevent the Jews from coming into Eretz Israel. So we had this group of older teenagers who would volunteer to come. And they were en route to their ship in the Mediterranean coast of Italy. And they received en route that the British had found out their ship. And so they were rerouted into Rome. And while in Rome, they were taken to see the various sites, including the famous Arch of Titus. And when they heard the story about how this was the Roman victory over the Jews, and that Rome put out at that time a coin called Judea Capta, the Jews are captive. And when these teenagers heard that story, one of the older ones took out a piece of chalk from his pocket, and in big bold letters he scrawled at the base of the arch, Judea viva, the Jewish people lives on. And I want to tell you that when I see a lot of polarization about going on with Israel today, what pains me is the loss of the miracle that is the existence of Israel. And, you know, running a country is messy, but we should not lose sight of what an historic achievement that is, that in our time we have managed to have the state of Israel. And so what these survivors did, and in the camps and then afterwards in their communities is so extraordinary. And so my focus tonight of Zachor is not just the memory of those who died, but the memory of those who lived and who rebuilt their lives. And I want to move from this macro to a micro. Now, the rabbi mentioned that my wife was a survivor, and at the age of 42, she decided that she felt the need to become an artist. And she wove the most complicated, she became a weaver. And at that time, artists did not weave. Craftsmen wove. Artists did the design, craftsmen did the weaving. And by the way, I do tours of my wife's tapestries, and when I have young kids, I distinguish between craft and art. Craft is the how-to, and the art is the message that's being expressed through the craft. By the way, once I had a group of young 7th graders, and when I made that point, and afterwards at the end I said, "What's your takeaway point?" And this 7th grade said to me, "You know, I never knew that paintings and tapestries had feelings." I want to tell you, when you reach a kid on that level, it was, you don't know exactly how to respond to something like that. And, or even the 16-year-old girl writes me, "Sing what your wife did," or I'm holding off that story because now I want to explain to you what my wife did. So I'm moving macro to micro. And the rabbi was nice enough to set up okay, so here are the pieces. In reality, these weavings are 6 foot high and 4 feet wide. Now my wife was 4'10". How she got how to do these was really quite something. So this is not her first. The first ones were she had to learn the craft of how to weave. And then when she did that, she was able to get into the emotional experience. Now I want you to see how that emotional experience manifests itself in this work of art. This is called, there's a Yiddish expression that you hold God to account when tragedy occurs. And she wanted to put God in this tapestry. Technically, it was very easy. I'll hold that because it was so technically easy that that the issue was theological. Where do you put God? On top, on the bottom, in the middle? For weeks she didn't sleep. She said, "I can't resolve this. Everybody's going to have to grapple with the issue of where was God." But look what she did. Here the flames, instead of rising literally from the ground, descend from the heavens. And there's 6 points of those flames coming down. And now look what's on the bottom. This is hard to make out at first, but the bottom is the profile of a seated woman bent over in mourning. This is the curve of her back, her hair, her thigh, her back, her bosom, and between the woman and the flames are 2 arms, one with tefillin on it, trying to protect her, to ward off the flames. And here, the opening, the womb is open, meaning not only did 6 million die, but all the children and all the generations that will forever remain unborn. This is what happened on her 3rd time, or her 3rd tapestry. She was finally allowing the emotion to get expressed. By the way, if any of you have any comment at all, I don't want this just to be a lecture. I always, when I have smaller groups, I encourage, reactions to some of this stuff. But this is a very powerful piece to respond to. But what happened with this piece dealing with the broader aspect of the Holocaust allowed her now to get personal. And what happened when she got personal? But now, Rabbi, I need your help. Thank you. Now what? Okay. Okay.
Leave it up here, or you can just reference it.
No, I'm sorry, that's the last one. There's an order here. Yeah. Okay. Now here is her personal story. Whoops. Okay. Now you have to understand, these are just photographs. The originals are much more powerful, and also they're three-dimensional, which of course this is not. But look at this piece itself. On top, that arrow represents an airplane, and it's dropping bombs on the field of flowers. And these are the bombs coming out of the airplane. And what you have on the bottom are the field of beautiful flowers whose heads are all tilted in sadness. And at the bottom lies a dead child with a primordial head, a broken right arm. But look, there's a flower growing on the child's left wrist, meaning that even in the most bleakest moments, there was still the aspiration for life. And obviously, the dead child was herself. And when she took it off the loom and hung it up, she became absolutely hysterical. And her right arm became paralyzed. And we went to doctors all over the place, and finally the doctor said, it's not physical, it's psychological, psychosomatic. And so she went into psychoanalysis, and through the analysis came out that through her weaving, she was surfacing experiences which were so painful. Could you imagine that subconsciously she tried to prevent herself from continuing by self-paralyzing her arm? The analysis was successful. The arm came back. And not only the arm came back, one of the gains was, at that time, anytime we'd go on an airplane flight, she'd get to a state of anxiety because to her, an airplane was not a vehicle of transportation, but an instrument of death. But after that, she had no fear at all of flight. And this was the breakthrough. And once she broke through, here's what happened. Yeah. This is her last tapestry, and it's the only one that's done for a specific occasion. And the occasion was the bar mitzvah of our son. And what was her message to our son? Well, if you look at the top, you have the 10 Commandments. And they're supposed to represent that they've been wrenched out of the rock of Sinai. And if you look at these tablets, they're jagged-edged. Why are they jagged-edged? Her message was, they're jagged-edged because everyone's life is filled with difficulty, with challenge, with trauma. That's the human condition. And the challenge is not denying the condition, but how do we master that condition? And so, on top, you have the 10 Commandments. The letters don't remain fixed, static, and locked, but they add up to Birkat Kohanim, Yivarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha, and this bracha cascades over the bottom of the tapestry over our son, who's represented by that thick purple yarmulke. Sorry. I guess I let my enthusiasm get the better of this contraption. So The bracha cascades over our son there, who's represented by a thick purple yarmulke. His face is bowed forward to show that he's bowing his head as he receives the bracha. And I love this. He's covered by a talit shaped like wings to bear him up to Sinai. And her message was, you stood at Sinai. And because Sinai took place in the Midbar, the desert is a metaphor for a hostile, non-nurturing world, our tradition demands that no matter how rough the going, we always have to affirm life. This was the message to our son. More importantly, it was the message to herself. And when she finished this, she closed the loom and never touched it again. Why? Because this therapeutic process was so effective that it unleashed a burst of energy that in a couple of years, she got her undergraduate, graduate, and became in a psychoanalytic training and became a psychotherapist. And as a psychotherapist, we're going to hear, we're going to do now. Whoops. I'm getting enmeshed in all this technology here, but is this working? Okay.
Yeah, it's really working. It might be easier.
Okay.
Put this in your pocket so it's not in your way.
Okay. So what we're going to hear now is a talk that my wife gave in 1988 in Jerusalem. Now, my wife had a skill I've never seen anybody else possess. She could tell somebody off, and they walk away smiling. She never taught me how to do that. Because she's basically castigating the audience. Why? For referring to survivors as victims. Her thesis was they were once victims, but those who had the ability to create new lives, to marry, to have children, to become leaders in communities. She said, these are moral and spiritual victors. And by referring to them as victims, you're pushing them into their negated past. This is her talk, and then how she applies that talk certainly will be the functional conclusion, and the rabbi will, okay? Your rabbi has many skills, so. Just to repeat her opening line was, I'm not a speaker, but I'm a professional listener. So her role as a psychotherapist. Yeah.
First, let me say that, like Rabbi Shlomo, I am not a professional speaker. However, I am a professional listener. The title of my paper is The Stigmatization of Unfound Heroes. It was difficult for me to prepare it, for it evoked grateful memories of my own experiences, as well as those of the survivors and their children who had passed through my office, carrying the burden of their legacy. What is this legacy? And how will it be passed on to future generations in a constructive and meaningful way? My major point is that we have to change this legacy from the stigma of victim to that of a moral and spiritual victor. As I studied the psychoanalytic literature on survivors and their children, I found that much of the research was based on a diagnostic specimen called the survivor's syndrome. This categorization, which was established as a base for the German reparations in the 50s and the 60s, relies heavily on pathology and has created a stigmatized image which needs to be redressed. Dr. Niederland, who formulated the Holocaust syndrome, describes it as survivor's guilt, chronic anxiety, tension, depression, persecutory nightmares. These classifications have unfortunately found their way into the literature and have unfairly stigmatized many survivors. I once attended a lecture open to the general public on Holocaust survivors and their trauma. It was given by a prominent psychologist. Next to me sat a tall, elegant woman, well-groomed, beautifully dressed, and as we say in French, elle était tirée à quatre épingles. She looked proud and confident. As the lecturer began to expound on the pathology sustained by the survivors and damage done to their children, I felt my anger rising. I involuntarily turned my head and noticed that this proud woman sitting next to me had slid down in her chair, her shoulders hunched over, her face no longer visible. She had changed from a proud person to a defeated woman. I conducted an informal survey in which I asked people unconnected to the Holocaust what their image of survival was. Their responses were tuned in exclusively on the pain, terror, and helplessness of survival. Not one tuned in to the inner strength and courage it took to survive the inferno. There was no awareness that alongside the horror, valiant attempts were made to maintain their dignity and hold on to their values. There was no listening ear available, and so they had to turn to each other for solace, support, and temporary relief. As to the second generation, they too have now been stigmatized by a classification called children of survivor syndrome. Loosely defined, destructive identification with the parents who refuse autonomy to their children, the parental use of children as transference objects for their unexpressed rage, death anxiety communicated to the child as overprotectiveness, and death guilt translated into feeling of worthlessness. Norman Salva, who did a study, found that these statements are without any supporting data, and they must be viewed as speculation. Anna Ornstein, too, questioned the assumption that survivor parents exploit their children emotionally. These labels have stigmatized survivors and their offspring. They have been picked up now by the media and made their way into the public consciousness. The time has come to address the situation. Out of empathy with their fate, we have focused on the suffering of survivors. But in that process, we have lost sight of their moral and spiritual resistance that enabled them to survive, to form new relationships, to marry, to bring children into this world, and make important contributions to Israel and Jewish communities around the globe. I am calling for the integration of the spiritual resistance with the trauma, which hopefully would remove the stigma and change the survivor's legacy from being a burden to one that not only their children can be proud of, but can serve as a source of inspiration for future generations. So in the deepest sense, the survivors have affirmed the eternity of the Jewish
one of my major activities, what keeps me alive at 99, is conducting tours of my wife's Holocaust tapestries, and especially with young people, because I find that there are not enough examples that are inspiring. And the point is this, that when I've got like teenagers, I said, all of you have trauma, all of you anxiety. The question is, what do you do with it? And my wife used to say, the advice we're usually given, put it behind you and move on. And she said, wait, there's something deeper that can be done. And that is use the trauma and transmute that trauma into creative energy. She says, you know, all great art comes out of trauma. That's why these artists are so hard to live with, because they're basically traumatized individuals. So this idea of what we could see as bad things can be tools to create a new life. And so the final message I always say to them, teenagers, is all of you have trauma, but none of your trauma is traumatic as Shoshana's. And if she could master hers, you can master yours. And the final thing is, what's the best way to heal trauma? To use it to heal others. That's the going away. That's the message. It's the message of Shoshana, and it's the message of the Jewish people. תודה רבה. Wow. By the way, I just want to introduce my daughter from Boston, who's here, who doesn't like me to make this public, but she lives in Boston. And when I'm asked, you live alone? I said, yes. They said, don't you have care? I said, yes. They said, how much caregiver do you get? I said, 24/7. They said, that's a lot. Who gives it? I said, my daughter in Boston gives it. So,
ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a question and answer session with Ted, where you'll get a chance to be able to ask him some questions. Just put this in here.
okay.
You go have a seat.
This is the tough part now. Okay,
So,
that's Rabbi.
Just before we begin, I want to say on behalf of everyone that came out here tonight and everyone that's watched it live, just tilt it down so they can see him. Everyone who's watched it live and everyone who's seen it, I must share that it was an incredible inspiration to hear you speak. And I could feel the power and the bravery and the courage of your wife Shoshana in the room. My mother is also a Shoshana. So I know Shoshanas are the very best women in the world. And I'm inspired, as I think everyone here is, that a man of your young age, by the way, you're the best looking 98-year-old I've ever seen in my whole life. That this is what you want to be doing with your time, and sitting there talking to teenagers, taking them on this journey is a tremendous, it's this most beautiful thing. And all I could think of when I saw those tapestries that she was weaving is that she was literally weaving life into the death. She was taking the most beautiful, powerful concepts and bringing them out of her darkened past. And to see someone that has given so much to so many for so long, who wants to do it every day, it makes me want to re-sign an extension with this synagogue for 94 more years, because I'm 4 years into a 5-year contract. So 98 more years, Be'ezrat Hashem, for the synagogue. We have a beautiful community here, an eclectic community, some that know more, some that don't know as much. But a person of your stature that has gone as a teenager to see with your own eyes what was going on in the DP camps, and to receive the briefs throughout that time, and to live there, and to live that life gives you a unique perspective. And I wanted to have people ask not just general questions about the Shoah, but questions that were related somewhat perhaps to your expertise and your personal experience of the matters. If I could just start off our question. Yeah. From death we have seen that a person can take life. What that means to me is that from the smallest amount of death, you could perhaps bring the smallest amount of life. And from the largest amount of death and the largest amount of destruction, like they say, the greatest darkness is what comes before the dawn, can bring the largest amount. What was the thing that shocked you the most, that made an American boy decide, instead of running after being a banker, a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, to dedicate his life to the Jewish people? What darkness did you see that made you want to shine so bright?
Well, thank you for the brightness compliment. Being in France at that age was such a, it changed my life, actually, in two ways. One way was seeing the destruction that took place and feeling that somehow, in some small way, I want to try to fill a piece of that the void that was empty. But the second piece, more personal, was I saw that you can make a difference in people's lives. That was a very big insight. I mean, at that time, you know, when you're young, you know, you're very self-centered in the way, you know, you're struggling where you're going to go, what your profession is, what your future is going to be. That's what you are. But this gives you room for something else, you know, and that part of self-realization can be realized through what you can help others realize self-realization. That was the big thing. And a great line by Einstein goes like this. It says, you make a living by what you can get. You make a life by what you can give. So this was, this is what shaped the rest of my life. And the rest of it were, I will say varieties, but were elements of it. You know, when I came to the Council of Jewish Federations in 1968, and this was a powerful umbrella organization, and it was called the Council of Jewish Federations and Welfare Funds. So these were nice, well-to-do Jews who wanted to do the right thing, but welfare was their Jewish connection. And I said, that's dealing with the Jewish past. What about the Jewish future? And the rationale for helping Israel was there were Jews in need in Israel as there were Jewish needs in other places. I said, wait, you know, when I finished, you know, my career there was 23 years, the welfare funds was removed from the title of the organization, and the rationale was we were partners in nation building. That was the big thing. If you want another example, was in 1963, I was bothered that Israel was invisible in New York. It's hard to believe, it was invisible. And I was director of American Zionist Youth Foundation, and we used to every we'd have a celebration in Central Park. And one time I said, we're only talking to each other. How about our message reaching others? And that's when I got the idea of the parade. So what I had was the youth movements, because that's what I was directing, and the schools. What I didn't have were the mockers, the big important. When I went to the mockers, it got rejected. Why? For two different reasons. The committed Jews said, a parade? That's okay for the Irish. How does it fit into the Jewish intellectual cultural tradition? And the non-Jewy Jew says, what, you're going to parade your Jewishness publicly in the street? So on the two grounds. So the first year was tough, the second, and what made it was the third year. And the third year came out on the Sunday before the Six-Day War. So I changed it from a parade to a demonstration of solidarity. And we had 250,000 people who came. And that changed it. I had, I don't, maybe most of you know, Victor Borghi was a Jewish, well-known Jewish performer at the time. And I had him as guest of honor. And he said to me, how long should I plan to be here? So I said, well, based on the prior 2 hours. It takes a long time for 250,000 people to pass by a 1 hour passed, 2 hours, 4 hours. Finally he turns to me, he says, look, Ted, I don't want to be rude, but my wife is expecting me for dinner Thursday evening. So it's nice to have an anecdote that sort of encapsulates and captures what was happening. And after that, everybody recognized the value.
I want to share. I'm not sure everyone knows what we're talking about. There's the Celebrate Israel parade. There's something like 50, 60,000 people this last year that walked down the streets. Many of your children in the Ramaz groups, in the schools from Brooklyn, in the schools, at all the different Jewish schools, marched down the street on Fifth Avenue. That is the parade that Ted started. And that is the parade he was just referring to. Now, the last bit, which I think kind of brings this full circle, is that for so many years, all these Jews were marching down Fifth Avenue, and they had a big problem. And again, it's hard for me to say this in the synagogue, but their problem was, where could 50,000 Jews go to pee? Enter the Edmund J. Safra Synagogue. Oh. We're about 50 feet from Fifth Avenue. So we would get a stream of people knocking on the door asking to come to the bathroom. When I first became the rabbi here, I said, if they can come here to pee, why can't they come here to pray?
Oh, wow.
And,
wait a minute, that's a great line.
Thank you. And what we did was we had a minyan for Mincha and Mariv every half hour on the half hour. And we said instead of them eating non-kosher halal off the trucks, we would open up an Israeli shuk in the basement.
Oh my God.
And we had over 3,000 people detoured through the synagogue on that day.
Wow.
Little did I know that I'm going to mention her name, Yehi Zechra Baruch. Little did I know that that year, as a surprise, Mrs. Lily Safra, Alea Shalom, turned up on the day and found out that there was 3,000 people walking in the synagogue. Now, just to understand, she made sure that every tissue box was in place, that the synagogue was a sanctuary, and here music was blasting, kids were on the floor drawing posters to hold up at the parade, writing letters with crayons to the Israeli soldiers. There was falafel being cooked and served. There was music blasting, and I thought that I'd lost my job. And my daughter, I was actually fixing the music over here, and my daughter came up in a panic and said, Abba, Mrs. Safra's here. I ran down the stairs 2 at a time, and I caught up to her in the basement, and I was ready to apologize, and she looked around at all the kids and the falafel and the sound and the noise and the crayons, and I said, Mrs. Safra, it's not usually like this. And she said, this is wonderful. We have to help you do this more often. So to have you in this synagogue is a remarkable closure, is a remarkable circle. There was one story I want you to tell about the weaving from a chazan, because you started with a chazan today. A chazan who got his voice back for Yom Kippur. Yeah. But there was also a story of a conductor who was writing his music, who got to see your wife's tapestries and your presentation. You shared it with me the other day. A guy was writing an opera.
Oh, so here's a 35-year-old member of the JDC board who joined a student group. It's a tour. It happened to be an in-house tour. And he writes me afterwards the following email. He said, by profession, I'm a musician, and I'm right now occupied in composing an opera, but I just can't get it to cohere until I came to your apartment. And I saw what your wife did with her trauma, that out of that darkness, she created such beauty. Suddenly, he says, I remember when I was 5 years old, my mother died. It was so traumatizing. I shut the door on that emotion and never opened it. But seeing what your wife did, I've opened that door, and I now feel a new flush of energy in composing my opera. So when you hear stuff like that, you know, it's very, talk about nachas, you know, it's really,
Okay.
it's wonderful.
Would anyone like to ask a question?
Hi, first of all, I love your speech.
A little bit louder.
First of all, I loved your speech. It was very touching. Secondly, what made you come to the
I'm sorry, would you, I'm a little hard of hearing, so if you don't mind, yeah.
What made you decide to want to become a motivational speaker? What motivated you to motivate yourself to do what you're doing now?
I was going to make it simplistic by saying it comes with the territory. I mean, if your goal is to inspire others, what's the goal? If you ask me to sign up, what do I? It's to become engaged in the creative continuity of the Jewish people. It could take a variety of forms. But to me, that's sort of the larger frame of reference. But to do that, people have to be motivated. And there have to be people who are great at writing, but not at speaking. People who are speaking and are writing. You know, it takes a variety of forms. But in my case, I found that what was important, when I would go to Europe and try to, you know, develop a professional cadre or the leadership there, you're speaking to people, and you have to make it interesting and motivational. Why should they bother? I mean, to do what I'm asking them to do takes time, effort, and money. Why would they do it? So sometimes, you have to find the language, but beyond it all, you have to have the passion. It's the music, you know, that goes with the libretto. So I'm into opera, but so both elements. Good question.
Beautiful.
Anybody else? So
Go ahead. Just loud.
Hi, thank you so much for what you shared. It was very moving. I wondered if it was ever difficult for you to relate to your wife's experience throughout the Holocaust.
No, because let me put it this way: she wasn't in a camp. She wasn't in Auschwitz. So, in other words, you didn't have that kind of trauma, and she was able to talk about it. But I try to, when I'm dealing with this tapestry tours, I mentioned before, explaining craft and art, that why does one do art? One does art because you express through the art something that you can't put into words. Because people say to me, is this what your wife said about the tap? I said, if my wife could explain that about the tapestry, she wouldn't bother with the tapestries. It took 2 years to weave these 5 tapestries. And by the way, shifting a little bit from the question to another point related to it, I once asked my wife, why did you choose weaving? It's so much more complicated than painting. And listen to what she answered me. She says, because paint, which derives from chemicals, is inert. And a painting, when completed, is fixed in time. Whereas with wool, which comes from a living animal, there's constant movement and change in a tapestry as there is with life itself.
Wow.
Wow. Talk about that's. And one of the things was, of course, with the tapestries was my enjoyment. When she became a psychotherapist, you know, I'm no longer part of that. And so once, tragically, she had Alzheimer's at the end, tragically. And I get a call from somebody who wants to speak to my wife. I said, what's it about? And he said, during the Holocaust, I was a hidden child, But I came to America and became very involved in the Association of Hidden Children. And when we organized, one of our major goals was to establish support groups to help us address our childhood traumas. And he said, your wife led a very large group for many years. She wouldn't take a penny in payment, and she literally altered our lives. I said, you're moving me to tears. I said, tragically as Alzheimer's. And her gasp, and he breaks down sobbing. And then I realized, like a therapist is like a surrogate parent, So it was like losing mama, a second time. So why did she leave the art? Because she really wanted to deal with people rather than with material. So that was an intermediary step for her, because ultimately she really wanted to be somebody who was impacting on people directly rather than, but in the end, the irony of it, in the end, she's impacting on more people through her tapestries than she is through her live thing. I mean, to me, it's a miracle that she's dead 12 years and she's impacting on young people today. I mean, if you ask me where this comes from, it's a mystery. But somebody asked me, an 8th grader asked me, what do these tapestries mean to you? And I said, they're a perfect illustration of my wife's thesis about the transmutation of trauma. Because when she died, I took the trauma of her death and I transmuted that into conducting these tours of her tapestries. So that was the way I took a downer, and made something constructive out of it, which is her point. She says, the darkness doesn't have to stay there. It could be a source of usefulness. That's a very profound idea. And most people don't see. You're depressed and that's it, You're done. The other message I want to say, before I mentioned teenagers, but when I get older groups, I said a lot of people feel if they haven't made it by 40, they never will. And I said, my wife was 42, and she started 2 careers as an artist and then as a psychotherapist. So age does not necessarily dictate the finality of your potentials.
Beautiful. Jack.
I'm sorry, what is it?
She said maybe the way that you've channeled all of this and how much beauty you're putting out is the secret to your beauty.
Thank you.
Jack. Loud.
I would like to know how you and your wife met. And as a follow-up,
Well, how we met, there are 2 versions. One is that I rescued her, and the other where we were introduced by mutual friends, but my children preferred the first version of the... the second one is?
who do you find that is inspiration? You spend your life inspiring so many. Who inspires you?
Who inspires me today? You want a serious response? You'll understand. You're grateful that I'm coming here to share. I'm grateful for you. It has meaning to me being here and getting your positive response. This is, I can almost cry. This is what makes my life at 99, still have meaning and have purpose. So I've got one surviving colleague, and he says, where do you get the energy to do what you do? I said, you're only focused on the energy needed to do it. You don't talk about the energy that you get back from doing it.
Sorry, back.
Thank you. It's overwhelming just being in your presence.
How did I say?
She's asking me to set up a Google form so that everyone could sign up to come to your apartment to get the actual tour of the tapestries.
Well,
Is that okay?
good. Okay, first of all, there's an organization called Dorot. Yeah, and Dorot services the needy elderly. Dorot, pause. How did this whole thing get started? So happened that the daughter of a friend of mine came to the apartment, saw the tapestries, and she's the director of volunteer services at Dorot. And they have a large contingent of students, volunteers. And since I live around the corner from them, she had them come in. This proved so popular that when the pandemic came, she called me and said, listen, we're continuing the volunteer program. The service will be done virtually by the volunteers, but since all the previous volunteers said that the highlight of their Dorot experience were the tapestries. So not to deny them, would you be ready to do this virtually? I said, listen, I'm totally helpless when it comes to the, to the technology. She says, Dorot will handle the technology. And because of that, it's any of you who are interested in having this tour, for any group, it's available free of charge. Dorot does it, as a public service, and of course I don't charge, and it's available. So the answer is, the virtual is available any place, anytime. And the in-house is available to anybody who wants, I need a group, but by the way,
Can we get you a group? I think there's enough people here who would want to come in person. Is that okay?
Wait a couple of weeks because we're just restoring the last of the 5 tapestries. The big news is the Claims Conference got German reparations, and they're putting on an exhibition of the tapestries at the Yeshiva University Museum. My big problem was, I don't know if my daughter will be happy by saying this, but what's happened to the tapestries after I'm gone? After I'm gone, what happens to the tapestries? So everybody says, donate them to a museum. And I said, absolutely not, for 2 reasons. Number one, if you're not Picasso, you're in the basement. And maybe every 10 years they give you a show. But the second reason, which is more impressive for me, is my focus on them is less as works of art than as tools for teaching. It's their message that it's focused on. So therefore, I want them to be in a learning environment. The problem is the schools that I've gone to don't have the space for these things. So right now, we're engaged with the New York UJA Federation to see whether in their building there's an appropriate slot. So, this is an issue. Okay, I think there's one more there, and then, yeah.
I want to know a little bit more about the children that you met, the orphans and the child survivors, and how you connected with them and how you were able to speak with them. And because you were young at the time. And a follow-up question to that is, after you listened to people's stories, how did you cope? And how did you feel because it was so immediately after all of the horrible things that happened?
It's interesting. One of the pieces I was referring to, no, I don't have it. There was an event here in Washington, from OZE. That was the organization where the children were in there. And they asked me to come and speak and share my experiences with them. Afterwards, these 2 grandmothers came over. Did I remember they were children in the children's home? And just as a cute aside, one of them said to me, my wife had the feeling that you had a crush on her. I'm 21 and she was a gorgeous 16 or 17-year-old. I'm saying, how do you handle this question? So all of a sudden I said, of course I did, but so did every man who saw her. So you get out of the particular by generalizing. But for me, here, I was dealing with them and they were, 12, 16, and now they're all grandmothers, in the end, so let me close by, I started with a story with Elie Weisel, right? So I'll close with him, because part of my original attempt was to talk about him, but then I decided I think it was more important to talk about the theme of what she talked, the unsung heroes of my life. And so the closing line from Elie Weisel, I won't go into the story, it was just that, just give me another second. Just put up with me another second. Okay. All right. Okay. When I was with the Council of Jewish Federations, I brought Elie Weisel to address them. He was well known in certain circles, but not among the machers. He wasn't. And by bringing him to the General Assembly, and he knocked him out the first time. And he said, and then they asked me to bring down the second time. So, when you're a programmer, you never try to repeat something that was successful because it'll never have the original newness to it. And when he was in New York, he used to come to our house for Friday night dinner when he was single, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, I'll never forget the ethereal quality of his Shabbat Zmirot. And then my closing story describes the scene at the General Assembly of the Council of Jewish Federations in 1971 in Pittsburgh. After his powerful debut the year before, there was a clamor for his return, and this time was in the form of a Saturday afternoon Oneg Shabbat, where Elie read from a work in progress. He walked into the room, sat down at the table with his manuscript, looked out at the audience, closed his eyes, and started singing a Yiddish song. And the English translation was, "If I had the strength, I would rush through the streets shouting the holiness of the Sabbath." And after reading it, he closed his manuscript, looked up, and again repeated the song in Yiddish. And my closing comment, and why I'm bringing this, fortunately for all of us, he did have the strength to run through the streets of our consciousness, proclaiming his message of the sanctity of life. It is our hope that Elie will continue to have the strength for many years to come to proclaim his call to moral action. He said Zachor is not, is an active verb. It has to be, it's to make us all more caring, more compassionate, more responsive, and thereby more human. And by making us more human, he enables us to touch the divine. Thank you.
Incredible. I know that song. Bolti Toya. That's a good. This is yours. Me on the cue. That was absolutely a tour de force. It was remarkable. It was touching. It was informative. It was profound. People are forever changed for having met you. Thank you, Ted.
My pleasure.
I'd love to bring a group to the house for students. Okay. Bezrat Hashem, we will. Okay. Is that it? All the wires are gone? Okay. Amazing.